An original podcast from podlatino.com.
The doctor glances up from the prescription, already done writing, and says, "We need to operate." The sentence probably lasted 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, something happened inside the patient's mind that's worth examining. A significant number of questions simply didn't get asked. Why this option and not another? Are there alternatives? How much time do I have to decide? They just hung there, unspoken. Not because they didn't exist, but because the person on the other side of the desk had a diploma on the wall, a medical chart in hand, and a certainty in their voice that, combined, produced something hard to resist. The feeling that there was no longer any need to keep evaluating. This isn't a story about manipulation or medical negligence. It's something far more ordinary and, in a certain way, far more interesting. It's an example of how authority works as a psychological mechanism, not just as a power structure. Authority doesn't need to impose itself by force to have an effect. Often, all it has to do is show up, to be recognized as authority, and people's behavior shifts in meaningful ways. Psychology has been studying this phenomenon for decades, and what it found is uncomfortable enough to sit with. People don't only obey when they're afraid or when they have no other choice. They also obey when they trust, when they sense that someone knows more, when the hierarchy is clear, when a title or a uniform or an institution backs the person speaking. And that obedience, in many cases, doesn't come from a conscious decision. It comes from something more automatic, something much harder to intercept. There's an experiment conducted decades ago that's still cited as one of the most disturbing in the history of social psychology. At Yale University, a researcher named Stanley Milgram recruited ordinary participants and asked them to administer electric shocks to another person every time that person answered a question incorrectly. The shocks weren't real, but the participants didn't know that. What they did know was that someone in a lab coat, carrying the apparent authority of science, was telling them to continue. And most of them did continue, even as the reactions from behind the partition suggested intense suffering. Not because they were cruel, but because someone who seemed to know what they were doing had told them to keep going. What that experiment revealed wasn't that people are fundamentally bad. What it showed is that authority can redistribute subjective responsibility. When someone we perceive as legitimate makes a decision or gives an instruction, a portion of our felt sense of responsibility shifts toward that figure. It doesn't disappear, it relocates. We feel that if something goes wrong, it's not entirely our fault because we followed what we were supposed to follow. That logic might sound like a trap, but it actually has a fairly reasonable explanation. Human beings need some way to coordinate social life. Nobody can evaluate every single decision they make in a day from scratch. When a doctor gives a diagnosis, when a judge hands down a sentence, when a supervisor gives an instruction, there's an implicit bet that this person has the knowledge, the experience, and the perspective to make that call better than we could in that moment. That bet isn't always wrong. Often, authority exists precisely because someone genuinely knows more about something, and following them is reasonable, even efficient. The problem isn't that authority exists, or that following it usually makes sense. The problem shows up when that tendency to obey keeps operating in contexts where it should be tempered by our own judgment. And that slide happens more easily than it seems, because authority isn't always built on real knowledge. Sometimes it's built on appearance. A title on the door, a confident tone of voice, a name backed by a well-known institution, a uniform that signals function. Those elements don't guarantee competence, but they work as signals that the brain processes quickly, almost without consulting explicit reasoning. In a well-known study, researchers found that people were significantly more likely to cross against a red light if they saw someone else do it first when that person was well-dressed than when they were in casual clothes. The appearance of status functioned as a signal of authority and changed other people's behavior without a single verbal instruction. Just the image. That explains why certain titles carry so much weight even outside the field where they were earned. Why a celebrity can recommend a financial investment and be taken seriously, even though their expertise lies somewhere else entirely. Why a doctor commenting on politics often gets more credibility from many listeners than a regular citizen with no credentials, even though the doctor doesn't know any more about politics than anyone else. The symbol of authority transfers. It extends beyond its original domain, and the mind accepts it with a readiness that, in retrospect, is striking. That said, questioning authority isn't easy, and resistance isn't always the right answer. There's something genuinely uncomfortable about pushing back against a figure of authority, even when something inside you is raising doubts. That discomfort has its own logic too. Questioning someone in a position of hierarchy carries a real social cost. It can make you seem ignorant, presumptuous, or difficult. It can create tension in a work relationship, distance in a family dynamic, or simply the feeling that you're wasting everyone's time with questions that whoever knows has already resolved. The discomfort of questioning isn't irrational. It's learned, cultivated over years of schooling, of working inside institutions, of living within hierarchies that generally require a degree of deference to function at all. That deference is functional in a lot of contexts. An emergency room can't operate if every nurse challenges every instruction from the attending physician. A team doesn't move forward if every manager's decision becomes a debate. There are situations where quick compliance is necessary and where constant questioning would be genuinely counterproductive. The point isn't to distrust every hierarchy or to live in permanent suspicion of anyone with more power or more experience. The point is to notice when the tendency to obey starts running on automatic in situations where your own judgment should carry more weight than it's being given. That requires something specific, learning to tell the difference between trusting an authority because there are solid reasons to do so, and surrendering your own thinking simply because the signal of authority is present. The first is a reasonable strategy for navigating a complex world. The second is a reflex that, in certain contexts, can lead to outcomes nobody would choose if they had taken a little more time to think. The difference between the two isn't always obvious in the moment, but there's a question that can help draw the line. If this same instruction came from someone with no title, no position, no institutional backing, using the same words and the same reasoning, would it carry the same weight for me? If the answer is no, it's worth asking which part of that weight belongs to the content and which part belongs to the symbol. What makes this hard is that authority is often right. Doctors do make accurate diagnoses. Experts do know their fields. Leaders sometimes make better decisions than the people who follow them. That reinforces the habit. Every time we follow an authority's instruction and it works out, the reflex gets stronger. And there's something almost paradoxical about that. Obedience works so well on average that it becomes difficult to notice the specific moments when it doesn't. Understanding this isn't a call to rebellion or a case for suspicion as a general stance. It's something more precise and more useful than that. It's recognizing that authority can guide, can protect, can bring order to what would otherwise be chaos, and that at the same time, someone occupying a position of authority doesn't automatically answer the question of whether what they're directing is the right thing for each specific situation. That assessment still belongs to you. Handing it over entirely without noticing, without choosing to, is exactly what the mechanism makes easier than it should be.